The goal of this video is to teach you how to generalize the concept of consumer surplus to the concept of aggregate consumer surplus, the consumer surplus for the entire market. But in order to do that clearly, I need to start with some more basic material. And the first thing I want to do is ask you to remember to recall what was the notion of an inverse demand function. You have seen this before. I'm just reminding you that if we have the graph for an individual with X and dollars per unit here, and we have the marginal benefit function for the individual, say something that looks like this, we saw that the demand function for this individual was given by this. That is the demand function as a function of P. But we also saw that that locus could be seen in two ways. From this perspective, for every P, it gives you the demand function. But importantly, from this perspective, we could invert this to get P demanded in the new notation of X, which tells us what is the price at which the consumer is willing to buy the quantity X. And we also saw that this locus of points was equal to the marginal benefit function. Okay? So remember that once you know the demand function, you know the inverse demand function, and from that you can infer that the consumer is rational is equal to the marginal benefit function that is being maximized. That was what we learned for the case of a consumer. Now, if we observe the aggregate demand function, we can also invert it and get a aggregate that I'm going to denote with a capital P, an aggregate inverted demand function. So this is going to be the inverse aggregate demand function. Now, what is the meaning of this demand function? In words, the meaning is the price at which all of the consumers want to buy X as a group. So as you move the price, the consumers in the market are going to want to buy a different amount, and this is the total price that gets all of the consumers in the market less to buy X. And a graph may be useful here. So think of this being the aggregate demand function, which we invert to get the inverse demand function for the market. Okay? And what this is telling us is what is the price P at which the market as a whole buys X. And a way of deconstructing this, say, I'm just going to plot two of the consumers for you here, is that if we were to bring back the price to the individual consumer diagrams, what we will have is that this will give us the quantity that the first consumer wants to buy, the quantity that the second consumer wants to buy, etc., that when we sum them at that price will give us exactly the quantity X that we are looking for. Okay. Now let's relate this aggregate inverse demand function to the underlying marginal benefit, just like we did for the case of the individual consumer. One important observation to do this is notice that all of the consumers that are buying at price P, the value of their last unit has the same marginal benefit. Has a marginal benefit, this is for person 1 equals to P, a marginal benefit for person 2 equals to P, etc. The only exception for which the marginal benefit is not the price is for a consumer that looks like this, for whom at that price the demand is 0. So for this particular individual, the marginal benefit, let me call this person N, the marginal benefit for N is less than P at 0. Okay? But for everyone else that is consuming something, the marginal value of consuming an additional unit is positive and equal exactly to the price. And what tells you is that the meaning of the inverse demand function is equal to this marginal benefit of giving an additional unit to an unconstrained consumer If you take anybody who's in the interior or just about to touch the price, that's also fine, something like this. If you give them an extra unit, how much extra benefit will they get? Exactly P. And that is the meaning of the inverse demand function. Now, the consumer surplus for the market, or aggregate consumer surplus at a price P, is going to be given by the sum of the consumers of the consumer surplus for person I at price P. So you sum over all consumers. And you can think about it as what is the total increase in well-being for consumers from being in the market. Okay, this was what is the total well-being in consumers from being in the market versus being in the no trade allocation. Is just the sum over all of them. Now, this is equal to the integral, the sum of the integrals from 0, again from 1 equals I to C, to the amount divided by person I of, if you recall, the inverse demand function minus the price times the x. That was the integral formula that we derived for every consumer. Now you have to add them overall. It turns out that this can be rewritten as the sum from 0 to the amount demanded in the market of the inverse demand function for the market minus P dx. I want to pass you a graphical intuition for why the formula for the market or aggregate consumer surplus takes this form. And I'm going to do it with an example of two consumers. So suppose that the demand function for one consumer looks like this. So this is consumer 1, and the one for another consumer looks like 2, like this. Let's say it's flatter like this. And then we have that the market demand function is going to look like this, something like this. Okay. So this is X demand for the market, which we can also, of course, write by inverting as P demand for the market at X. Now, this formula is telling us that if we want to compute the consumer surplus at one price, let's say that this is the consumer surplus for the market, and that this is the consumer surplus for person 2 at P, and that this is the consumer surplus for person 1 at P. Now, why does this formula work? Well, here's an easy way of seeing it. First thing that you can notice is that basically what we are doing here is at any price we are adding horizontally. So let's say up to this price P, we are adding nothing, and then in this bar, which is, let's say, between this price and a little bit lower, a little bit lower, what we are adding is that line here, which is exactly that line here. So let's say that what we are adding is this area red, we're adding that area red over there. For the next lower price, we do the same. Still, we haven't crossed that. We're going to keep doing it until we reach that point. So what we have done is we have added all of those red areas. We have just added there. You wish that line is just identical to that. Now, at that point, when we reach exactly that point, this area is plotted there. That is the red area from this consumer continues here. But now we also need to take into account the area from this consumer. So when we go to the next price, what we have is that the total area or that is plotted here under the curve in this direction is this area red that I'm going to highlight there, which is highlighted there, plus this area that is highlighted in black that is there. And you keep going down. Let's say for this bar you get this area, which is that area, and then that little bit you add there. Okay, so the point of this repetitive explanation is to show you that this area here, when you add these bins, the area under the curve in this direction horizontally, gives you exactly the sum of the two areas. But that means that that area is equal to the sum of consumer surplus for every individual, since those are the individual consumer surpluses. And that means that that area is what we want as the market consumer surplus. But what is that area? Is just, now let's flip axis to this direction, is the integral under the inverse market demand curve and the price, between that and the price curve, between 0 and the amount demanded in the market.